This past week, approximately 1,000 children, women, and men drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. Migrants trying to reach the other side, they were so desperate to leave what was behind, it was so terrible that they were willing to be herded onto vessels and ships, including, in one particular case, a boat that had no engine nor sail to try to get across this tricky passage. Onto this boat, they herded 600 people onto a boat without engine, sail, or any other means of propulsion. It was being pulled by a rope by a boat on which was holding 500 people. They got offshore, and the boat behind started to take on water. And as it started to sink, the captain ordered the rope to be cut. Of the 600 people on board, approximately 50 were rescued, leaving 550 women, children, and men either lost or drowned. All told, estimates are over this past week, 1,000 children, women, and men drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. And so naturally, what our social media, news reports, and nearly every channel of the internet have been filled with is the death of a gorilla at the Cincinnati Zoo. Harambe was a western lowland gorilla who lived his life there at the Cincinnati Zoo. A 4-year-old boy somehow made his way into the gorilla's enclosure. All of the female gorillas were called back and went inside, but the 450-pound male silverback, the dominant gorilla, did not go back inside. He came over to the child, grabbed him by the leg, and dragged him around, visibly agitated by all of the commotion that's pretty understandable going on up above. And the zoo's dangerous animal response team made the terrible and necessary choice that to save this little boy's life, the animal would have to be put down. And so Harambe was shot. Now here, it is a terrible story. Don't get me wrong. It is a terrible and shocking story. But here's the thing, because here's where it gets really bad and where it really gets tragic. Because social media and the internet has picked this up. And it has been running around, and it is nothing more or less than mob justice. There are online petitions started by hundreds of thousands of people, or tens of thousands of people, who never met this family, calling for DCFS to investigate them simply because they've decided somebody has to get punished. There are threatening phone calls and death threats received by a woman who happens to have the same name as the mother of this 4-year-old child. Not the same person. She happens to have the same name. She is receiving threatening calls because the internet has decided somebody must be punished. And we don't know how all this is going to turn out. The boy is fine. But we do know this. No matter what else comes of this situation, the mother of that little boy, her life has been irrevocably changed and honestly ruined. Because this is nothing more or less than a lynching. The internet is lynching her because it has decided somebody has to get punished. And so we come together today, and Jesus is on the move. In our gospel, he's left the town of Capernaum, where he encountered a Roman centurion, a Roman soldier, whose servant was ill, and the Roman soldier sent for Jesus, asked him to come and heal his servant, and then thought better of it, sent another message to say, you know, Jesus, I know you don't even have to come here. I know that would cause trouble for you. I know you've got the authority. Just say the word. And so amazed Jesus that he marveled at the faith and trust that this centurion had, marveled at this kind of faith and trust. And so the word has gotten out. The word has gotten out that when Jesus is around, things happen and God does amazing things. And so Jesus has left Capernaum with two crowds in tow. It's about a 25-mile walk, and two crowds following along with him. His usual crowd of disciples, those who were living their lives apprenticed to him to learn how to live as God would have them live. And then a whole host of folks who were curious, wondering, this great crowd that had heard about him and wanted to know more. 25-mile walk, a good long day's walk in that day when they come to the town of Nain. And on the way into town, strangers in this town, they come upon a very familiar and very sad sight, a funeral procession. Now, they're strangers in town. This is not anybody that they know. And so, just like us, as we encounter the hearse and the cars with the lights on, little flags stuck on the hood, we sort of step to the side and let it go, and we're sad for them, but really does not impact us. But not this time, because Jesus is there this time. And Jesus steps forward. Now, right behind the platform is the group of mourners, and in there is a woman with tears streaming down her face, heartbroken and sad, but also very scared, because she is a widow, and this was her only son. And in her day, that left her vulnerable. Oh, she was in such danger because she did not have any opportunity to work, to hold on to her possessions, to have someone take care of her. She was in danger. And it says that Jesus noticed her. And it says that his heart went out to her. And it's this wonderful word in the Greek that we don't really have in English. This wonderful word that means that Jesus was moved down in his guts for her. This wonderful word, his whole inside and being was moved for her, went out to her. His whole body and being, that love and compassion of God going through him to have compassion for her, to walk alongside her hurt. Jesus' heart went out to her, but not the dead guy. Did you notice that? Jesus' compassion is for her, not the dead guy. And Jesus steps forward and stops the procession, reaches out to touch the platform, turns to the dead body and says, "Young man, I tell you, get up." And he does. Jesus prophesies to the bones, and he hands him back to his mother, and in that moment, the breath returns to them both. Jesus cures the man. But much more importantly, he heals her and him, restores them to their rightful place in this world and in society. And that's a difference that's a little hard to grasp, that difference between cure and heal. Sometimes we pray for a cure, and certainly Jesus would do that as he did with lepers and things like that. We pray for a cure to disease, but there's a difference between cure and heal, because to heal is to restore back to the way God meant it to be. It's to place us back in the relationships and place in society where we belong, where things are as they ought to be. And to be honest with you, I have struggled with that difference, to understand that difference for a long time, until I met my friend Tom. And Tom Rogers, when I got to know him, was 59 years old, and he had lived as a quadriplegic for 40 years already. From the neck down, he could not move. And he'd lived that way for 40 years when I began staying with him to care for him, take care of him, and help him. And as I got to know Tom, and over the time I spent with him, we became very good friends. And I remember this one day in particular that my grandmother came over to visit Tom. Now, my grandmother was a woman of deep faith. And she had watched Tom grow up. She watched him get polio. She watched his life change. She had known him his whole life, and she came over to see him. And while she was there, as we were visiting, she asked if she could pray for him. And he said, sure. So she took her hands, she placed them on his unmoving ones, and she started to pray. She prayed and she prayed as my grandmother would. She prayed and she prayed. And then she started praying that God would cure Tom, that he would begin moving, that he could rise up from that wheelchair and walk, that he could move around on his own, that God would cure him. She prayed with conviction and with all her heart. And then when she was finished, as we wrapped up, she talked with Tom for a little while, and she went home, and Tom did not get up out of his chair. And I asked him about it later. I said, Tom, what's that like for you? He says, well, people do that. He says, I always appreciate it. I love when people pray for me. He says, and if it were to happen, that would be fine. He says, I don't pray for that. And I wondered about that for a long time. And it took me a while. As I got to know Tom and his life, as I got to know his heart and who he was, it took me a long time to figure out that Tom had long since been healed. He had been restored to the place where he and who he was supposed to be. Because Tom had so many friends, I could not keep track of them. He had people who loved him all over, and he was so filled with love for them that he wore me out trying to do things for them. His social calendar kept me hopping until I was exhausted. He had found the right place, and he was exactly who he was in this world, and I don't understand that. I can't imagine how that could be, except I know this. On Sundays when we'd go to church, he would sit in the back of the worship space and he would belt out the words of every hymn, utterly without tune, by the way. He could not carry tune to save his life. But he was singing at the absolute top of his lung, and I know somehow in there was healing. Tom had long since become who God made him to be. And that is what Jesus does. Jesus heals this dead guy and his mother by restoring them to the way God meant them to be. Right relationships, a healthy place, always working to make the system and things around them, the culture, better. And we know Jesus does this because it's what he does for us too. As we gather here, this is what heaven looks like. God's children gathered together shoulder to shoulder, very different from one another, but united around the same table, fed with God's very self, the body and blood of his Son, gathered to hear and be shaped by words of mercy, forgiveness, and grace, and then empowered, shaped, reformed, sent out into the world to be partnered with God, to make this world look more like heaven. This is what things are supposed to look like. And we know that Jesus heals because it's what he does to us too. When Jesus proclaims forgiveness, we are changed from that inside out. And we are made to look just a little more like God our Father. This is what Jesus does. Sometimes he cures. We've seen that. But most often, always, he heals. And we know this because it's what he does for us and is doing for us even as we gather today. Now, friends, I can't begin to pretend that I know what is going to cure this world. I can't begin to pretend that I know what is going to cure this world that values a gorilla more than a 4-year-old child. I don't know what's going to cure a world that would rather focus on punishing one situation that they have no connection to and ignores the death of thousands. So desperate to leave a situation that they will be herded onto a ship without an engine. I don't know what it is that will cure this world. And I don't know what it is that will cure the broken relationships in our own lives and in our midst. I don't know what it is that will cure this town of Valparaiso, Indiana. And I don't know what will cure the brokenness in your own lives too. But I do know this. God is the one who heals. God is the one who is healing you. And God is the one who even today is healing the world. And I know this because God is healing you so that you may go and be His hands to heal the world, partnered with God. Partners with God for the healing of all the nations. Thanks be to God.